In a small, modest apartment at the edge of the city lived Daniel and Maya, a young couple bound by love and shared dreams. Their life together was far from glamorous. Peeling wallpaper, a second-hand couch, and nights spent counting coins before paying rent. But within those walls, laughter often replaced luxury, and hope outweighed hardship. Daniel was ambitious, always scribbling ideas in a worn-out notebook, chasing visions of success beyond their neighborhood. Maya, gentle yet resilient, believed in him more than he believed in himself. She worked long hours as a teacher, sometimes stitching clothes at night to make ends meet, while Daniel juggled odd jobs and small ventures. They often spoke of the future, a little house with a garden, children playing in the yard, and a life where comfort would come from both love and stability. What they lacked in wealth, they made up for in devotion. Maya would surprise Daniel with homemade meals when money was tight, turning simple ingredients into feasts. Daniel, in turn, promised of the world, vowing that one day she would have everything she deserved. Their evenings were spent sitting by the window, dreaming aloud about the life ahead. Dreams painted with colors of sacrifice, loyalty, and trust. Yet, beneath this warmth, Daniel's hunger for more began to quietly grow. He adored Maya, but he often wondered what it would feel like to step into boardrooms instead of back rooms, to wear tailored suits instead of borrowed jackets, to drive cars instead of waiting for buses. Maya's presence soothed him, grounding his restless ambition, but the whisper of success outside their small world tugged at his spirit. For now, however, love kept them together. They faced every struggle hand in hand, promising that no matter how hard the road, they would always choose each other first. It was a promise Daniel believed with all his heart, until the glitter of wealth began to dim the light of their love. The turning point in Daniel's life came when he was offered an opportunity that seemed too good to refuse. A former classmate, Adrian, had become a wealthy investor with ties to high society. Adrian admired Daniel's sharp mind and business ideas, and he extended an invitation. Join him as a partner, where success and influence would follow naturally. At first, Daniel hesitated. The deal required long hours, travel, and immersing himself in circles where money, not morals, defined worth. Maya urged him to think carefully. She reminded him of the values they had built their marriage on: honesty, humility, and togetherness. But Daniel's eyes had already started to gleam with the allure of opportunity. Soon, Daniel was whisked into a world of glittering dinners, five-star hotels, and expensive suits. At Adrian's side, he mingled with businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. He shook hands with people he once only saw on television. It was intoxicating. Every compliment on his ambition, every invitation to another elite event, made him feel like he was finally stepping into the life he had always craved. But with this new world came distance. The late-night talks with Maya by the window grew rare. Dinner plates cooled on the table as Daniel canceled plans for urgent meetings. The laughter that once filled their home faded, replaced by long silences and Maya's quiet disappointment. She wore the same clothes and kept working tirelessly, while Daniel arrived in designer jackets, smelling of fine cologne and speaking of things she barely understood. Maya tried to remind him of who they were, the couple who once dreamed with nothing but love to guide them. But Daniel began to see their life differently. The apartment that once felt warm now seemed cramped. Her simple gestures of love felt small compared to the extravagant gifts and luxuries his new circle flaunted. The lure of wealth had wrapped around him like a golden chain, dazzling but tightening. And slowly, without realizing it, Daniel began to drift further from the woman who had once been the center of his universe. It was at one of Adrian's opulent parties that Daniel first met Isabella. She was everything the new world represented. Elegant, strikingly beautiful, and effortlessly confident. Draped in diamonds and designer gowns, she carried herself with an air of power that turned every head when she entered a room. Unlike Maya's quiet warmth, Isabella was bold, outspoken, and unapologetically ambitious. To Daniel, she seemed like a living embodiment of the wealth and success he had long desired. She praised his intelligence, admired his business acumen, and laughed at his stories as though he were the most fascinating man in the room. Her attention flattered him in ways he hadn't experienced in years. With Isabella, Daniel felt like he belonged to the elite world he had worked so hard to enter. At first, Their relationship appeared innocent. Late-night conversations after meetings, lingering glances at social gatherings. But soon, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into undeniable truth. Daniel found himself spending less time at home, claiming endless business obligations, while secretly being drawn deeper into Isabella's world of luxury. Maya noticed a change almost immediately. She saw the way his phone lit up with messages he hid from her, the cologne that lingered on him when he returned home late, and the growing impatience in his voice whenever she questioned him. Their once open conversations now ended in arguments or cold silence. Maya's heart ached, but she clung to the belief that it was just a phase, that Daniel would remember the love they had built together. She tried to reach him with gentle reminders of their past, cooking his favorite meals, leaving little notes of encouragement, even planning quiet evenings at home. But Daniel's mind was elsewhere, captivated by the glitter of Isabella's world. He began to compare them unconsciously. Isabella, radiant and glamorous, against Maya, simple and worn from years of sacrifice. The contrast only deepened his discontent. Soon, he justified his actions by convincing himself that Maya no longer fit the image of the man he was becoming. In truth, it wasn't Maya who had changed. It was Daniel, and though he didn't see it yet, every step he took toward Isabella was a step away from the very foundation that had built his dreams. The truth rarely stays hidden for long. For Maya, the signs had been there for months. The late nights, the evasive answers, the expensive gifts Daniel bought but never brought home. Still, she held on to hope, praying her suspicions were nothing more than shadows of doubt. But one evening, that fragile hope shattered. Maya had been invited to a charity gala hosted by Adrian, the same man who had pulled Daniel into this glittering circle of influence. She hesitated to go, but Daniel insisted, more out of appearance than affection. Dressed in a modest gown, Maya walked into the grand ballroom, her heart heavy yet determined to stand by her husband. What she didn't expect was to see Daniel across the room, his arm draped possessively around Isabella. The two looked radiant under the chandeliers, laughing together as though the rest of the world didn't exist. The crowd seemed to approve, their smiles feeding Daniel's ego, while Maya stood frozen, her heart breaking in silence. The whispers began almost immediately. "Isn't that his wife?" someone murmured. "And the other one, that's Isabella." Maya felt the sting of humiliation burn deeper than the betrayal itself. Her private fears had now become a public spectacle. When Daniel finally noticed her, there was no guilt in his eyes, only annoyance, as though Maya's very presence disrupted the image he was carefully crafting. He excused himself from Isabella, walked toward her, and with a forced smile, whispered through clenched teeth, "Why are you here looking like this? You're embarrassing me." The words cut deeper than any blade. Maya realized in that moment that the man she had loved, supported, and built her life with had chosen another. Not just another woman, but another world, one of glittering surfaces and hollow depths. With quiet dignity, Maya turned and walked away, her back straight even as her heart crumbled. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Instead, she left him to bask in his illusion, while she carried with her the unbearable weight of betrayal. That night, alone in their once shared home, Maya made a decision. If Daniel could discard her for the sake of wealth and appearances, then she would no longer waste her life waiting for him to remember who he once was. She would rebuild, not for him, but for herself. The morning after the gala was one Maya would never forget. The silence of the house felt louder than any argument she and Daniel had ever had. His absence spoke volumes. He hadn't come home. On the nightstand sat his cufflinks, carelessly discarded, a silent symbol of his growing distance. Maya stood at the kitchen window, watching the dawn break. For years, she had woken early to prepare Daniel's coffee, to greet him with a smile before he started his day. But as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the empty counter, she realized she had no reason to continue a routine meant for someone who no longer cherished it. Her days became a strange mixture of pain and clarity. At first, she wept quietly in the solitude of their home, clutching old photographs that reminded her of better times. Friends who once admired their marriage reached out cautiously, their voices filled with pity. Some whispered that she should fight for him, while others advised her to leave before her spirit was crushed further. But deep down, Maya knew the choice had already been made, not by her, but by Daniel. She began to focus on herself in ways she never had before. She returned to her art studio, a small space she had abandoned years earlier when Daniel insisted her creativity was a distraction from real responsibilities. There, with paint-stained hands and tear-filled eyes, she poured her paint onto the canvas, transforming grief into color, betrayal into brushstrokes. Slowly, her art began to sell at local exhibitions, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of independence. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to flaunt his relationship with Isabella. Their photos filled society pages, the two of them wrapped in a fantasy of luxury. Yet, beneath the glamorous images, cracks were beginning to form. Those who knew him whispered about his growing arrogance, his recklessness with money, and the way he treated Isabella not as a partner, but as another trophy. Maya heard these things, but she no longer allowed them to pierce her heart. She was too busy rediscovering herself, learning to stand tall, to smile without forcing it, and to live without needing Daniel's validation. The woman who once lived in his shadow was now beginning to find her light. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Maya sensed something deep within her, the strength to rise, and the quiet promise that her story was far from over. The months that followed were a season of rebirth for Maya. What began as a slow attempt to survive betrayal gradually transformed into a deliberate journey of rediscovery. Each day, she woke not to the weight of Daniel's absence, but to the freedom of her own choices. For the first time in years, she was living for herself. Her art, once a quiet hobby, was now blossoming into a career. Paintings that bore the rawness of her heartbreak attracted attention at exhibitions, not just for their beauty, but for the story they carried. Critics described her work as soul in motion, and collectors began to notice her talent. With every brushstroke, Maya wasn't just creating art, she was reclaiming her identity. It was during one such exhibition that fate intervened. A distinguished man named Alexander, a philanthropist and entrepreneur, stopped to admire her work. Unlike others who merely complimented her talent, he lingered, asking thoughtful questions about the meaning behind her pieces. Maya found herself speaking freely, her guard lowered in a way it hadn't been in years. Alexander didn't see her as Daniel's wife or the woman he left behind. He saw her, the artist, the survivor, the woman with resilience etched into every word she spoke. Their conversations grew beyond art. Alexander invited her to collaborate on a charity project supporting young artists from underprivileged communities. Through this, Maya rediscovered the joy of giving, of building something larger than herself, something Daniel had never encouraged. With Alexander, there were no masks, no conditions, only respect and genuine admiration. At first, she resisted the warmth she felt in his presence, wary of opening her heart again. The scars Daniel had left were deep, and trust felt fragile. But Alexander's patience was steady, never pushing, only offering friendship and encouragement. He became proof that love didn't have to be manipulative or conditional. It could be kind, uplifting, and liberating. Slowly, Maya realized she was no longer living in the shadow of her past. She wasn't the woman defined by Daniel's betrayal, but a woman standing tall in her own right. A woman who could smile again, not because she was healed entirely, but because she was finally free to begin anew. This was not just a chapter of survival. It was the beginning of a life she had never dared to imagine, one filled with passion, purpose, and the quiet possibility of love reborn. Time as a way of revealing truths that pride often hides. For Daniel, the glittering world he had chased began to lose its luster. The parties felt repetitive, the laughter hollow, and the companionship of Isabella strained under the weight of his growing arrogance. What once seemed like paradise had turned into a prison of vanity. His empire, too, began to crack. Reckless investments and poor decisions left him vulnerable, and the so-called friends who had cheered his rise quickly disappeared when his fortune faltered. Isabella, ever hungry for status, slipped away without hesitation, leaving him alone in the very emptiness he had chosen over Maya. It was during this low point that Daniel stumbled upon an article in a lifestyle magazine, a feature on Maya's art and her work with underprivileged youth. There she was, captured in a photograph, standing proudly beside one of her paintings, her eyes glowing with a strength he barely recognized. The words describe her as an artist, a mentor, and an inspiration to many. For Daniel, it was a bitter revelation. He had abandoned a woman of substance for an illusion, and now she stood radiant in a world where he no longer had a place. Driven by regret, he sought her out, hoping to find even a fragment of the love she once gave so freely. But when he finally saw her again, it was not as the fragile wife he had taken for granted, but as a woman reborn. Maya stood with Alexandra at her side, her laughter genuine, her presence commanding. Daniel realized then that she no longer needed him, and perhaps never truly had. For Maya, the encounter was not about revenge or triumph. It was closure. She no longer felt bitterness, only gratitude for the journey that had shaped her. His betrayal had been the fire that forged her strength, the wound that led to her healing. And so, the story came full circle. Daniel learned too late the cost of chasing hollow wealth, while Maya discovered the priceless treasure of self-worth, resilience, and love that was true. Her pain had transformed into power, and her past no longer defined her future.